Andy, my dude, have you heard of the magical website builder known as Squarespace?
Ugh, not another Squarespace ad. I feel like every podcast is sponsored by them.
Hey, don't knock it till you try it. Yes, okay, it is overhyped, but actually it lives up to the hype. Squarespace is like a website fairy godmother. With a click of a button, your site transforms into a beautiful masterpiece.
A website fairy godmother? That sounds interesting. What makes it so magical?
Well, for starters, those slick templates make anyone look like a professional web designer. Pick one, customize the colors and fonts to match your brand, and voila. Plus, the drag-and-drop fluid engine is so easy, your grandma could build a site on Squarespace.
Well, she did knit me a lovely scarf last Christmas. Maybe website design is next.
Exactly. And when you're ready to sell your Nana's handmade scarves online, Squarespace has built-in e-commerce. Add a store with one click. Get flexible payment options. Then watch those sales roll in. And when she wants to teach others her steezy scarf skills, Squarespace's new courses feature is just the ticket. Nana can set up her curriculum and enrollments and payments in a snap and become the next e-knitting influencer.
Oh, wow, you really sold me with the grandma angle. Sign me up for that free trial.
Just go to thenextreel.com/Squarespace and transform your site into a beautiful Squarespace masterpiece.
Well, thanks, Pete. Even though it's overhyped, Squarespace actually sounds perfect for Nana's site's needs. Appreciate the warning on the ads, though. I'll brace myself next time I listen to a podcast.
Anytime. Let me know if you need any help getting that site up and running. Andy, can you believe we've almost hit 700 episodes of The Next Reel?
I know, it's crazy. And with all the other episodes in our family of podcasts, we are well over 1,200 episodes of movie conversation. It's really pretty amazing that we've gotten to have these in-depth movie chats every week for over a decade now.
And we couldn't have done it without our loyal community of film fans. Their support over the years has meant so much.
For sure. That reminds me, we should give the merch store a shout out. Buying shirts from thenextreel.com/merch is a great way listeners can continue to support the show. Plus, they get to sport our great designs.
Absolutely. I think sometimes folks forget we have a variety of shirts, mugs, phone cases, and more available. In fact, a great place to start is with a shirt sporting the Next Reel's logo.
We also have that classic Fast Times Spicoli Surf School tee, or the weirdly popular Rusty's European Tour shirt.
The one from National Lampoon's European Vacation. Why is that so popular?
Search me, but we have sold a ridiculous number of those. I guess there are a lot of Rustys taking trips to Europe?
We're always adding new designs based on movies we've covered, like our brand new design for a streetcar named Desire, featuring a streetcar named Desire. So if you want to rep your love of TNR and films, head to thenextreel.com/merch.
Every purchase helps us continue to have these weekly in-depth conversations. So visit thenextreel.com/merch today.
And as always, thanks for listening and being a part of the Next Reel community. We've got lots more great movie chats coming your way. I'm Pete Wright.
And I'm Andy Nelson.
Welcome to The Next Reel. When the movie ends,
our conversation begins.
And Robin Hood is over. So it's time to talk. We're talking about Robin Hood, 1922. This is the Douglas Fairbanks classic film that in many ways introduces us to so much of the lore of Robin Hood and to this character in a way that is sort of cemented throughout movie history. And it kicks off for you and I would like to say, substantial series of Robin Hood movies over the years. And I mean, a lot of years, nearly 100 years will be encapsulated on this show in terms of talking about Robin Hood. And I'm very excited about it, but I'm not entirely sure why. Why are we doing this series again?
Well, I was trying to think about that. Like, what was it that led us to pick this particular property as something to talk about? And I don't know. We just started talking. I think it was when the new Robin Hood came out with Taron Egerton and Jamie Foxx. And we said, there are so many Robin Hood remakes and versions of that story. It'd be interesting to look at some of them. And, we just kind of started looking at them and we put together a list. Oh, this would be a fun one to talk about. That would be a fun one to talk about. And we built a list that was like 9 movies long. And then, of course, we're like, well, let's throw it to our Patreon supporters and let them pick. And so there are a few shifts on the list, but still, we're at 9 films. And it's an opportunity to look at a property that is, it's a public domain property that has been out there for a very long time. The character Robin Hood has been around, since at least the 1400s, if not earlier than that. And in ballads and all this sort of stuff. And the way that the story has changed over the years has been a very interesting thing. And I think that that's largely what we wanted to look at here is, what is it that's so interesting about this character? Much like King Arthur, another character that often gets interpreted over and over again in film. What is it about this character that is so indelible that people keep returning to the well to tell their own version of the story? Is it just the fact that it's public domain, so it doesn't cost anything to do it? Or is there more to this character that is drawing people in? So I think that's kind of what drew us in.
Well, that's certainly what drew me into this film and what keeps me thinking about Robin Hood. I think you're right. I don't think it's just that we're all real cheap and we need those sweet public domain characters.
We're talking about Hollywood here, Pete.
Yeah, right. I think there is something that hits the sweet spot for us as human creatures about this story of vengeance and of embarrassing those who have done us wrong. And that is right in the center of Robin Hood. And we're going to talk all about that right after this. Hey, everybody. The next reel is brought to you by Audible. And they have a fantastic deal that works for you and for us. Get a load of this. If you sign up for a trial account at Audible for free at audibletrial.com/thenextreel, you're going to be able to search for any audiobook you want and download it for free and keep it forever. Any book you want. They have 200,000 titles to choose from for all of your digital devices. They have fantastic apps on Android and iPhone and your computer. It's just fantastic. Free book at audibletrial.com/thenextreel. Now, because we know you love movies, we want to give you something to chew on this week.
We are talking about Robin Hood from 1922 with Douglas Fairbanks performing. And did you know, Pete, this is really interesting. Douglas Fairbanks actually, back in 1917, wrote his own self-help book. Did you know this?
There is something about that feels so right. So right, and yet so very wrong.
He actually wrote a number of self-help books. Well, this week's book we're looking at is called Laugh and Live by Douglas Fairbanks from 1917. This is a 102-year-old book where Douglas Fairbanks talks about how to, create a better life for yourself. And what he says his formula for happiness is humility, good humor, and particularly strenuous physical exercise. I can't tell you how much I wanted to read this book now. I haven't read it, but let me tell you, knowing that it's on Audible, I am going to download it and check it out because it's only 2 hours and 41 minutes. It's a very quick listen, and I am sure it's going to be a fun one to check out.
You could download this, or you could download Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire, and you could actually listen to this 22 times. You really should check out Audible. Yeah. I tell you, I've been an Audible subscriber for more than 16 years. I've got hundreds and hundreds of books, and I adore the service. It's one of those that I don't know what I'd do in the car without it. It's fantastic. Again, audibletrial.com/thenextreel. You'll be able to support this show and support the work that we're doing here. Thanks for your support. I have to tell you, Andy, I think this was a really charming film. I didn't know what to expect. And, I'm a little bit, I think, conditioned not to be wired for long silent film experiences. right? I don't see them very often. They're not a regular part of my movie diet. So I was a little bit nervous about, tracking with this one. And I'll tell you, I had a blast. It is much beefier on the backstory, on integrating what Robin Hood is for us and what Robin Hood is sort of is to this story, getting a whole lot of information about his, character work. It's his origin story. And I didn't expect the movie to be quite as invested in origin story material as it was. It felt very much like a James Cameron epic of 1922, right?
Well, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's how they went into it. I mean, certainly the budget, it sounds like they spent a lot on it. So it sounds like they were in line with James Cameron-esque thinking, at least in 1922 terms. I had a fun time with it too. I don't think I ended up enjoying it quite as much as you did. I thought it was a pretty interesting look at the Robin Hood character and a pretty interesting place to start because of how many kind of Robin Hood elements come from this. Yes, there was a 1912 version, which I couldn't find even just clips of to look at, so I can't really compare. But this is the one that people always say the Douglas Fairbanks version really kind of kicked off a lot of those Robin Hood tropes. And so it was an interesting one to look at and to see what they're doing with the character and everything. I felt like there were times where they were trying to figure out what the tone was going to be of the film. Sometimes it felt like they were doing a very fun romp of a family film, lots of fun, schoolyard silliness, all that sort of stuff happening. But then sometimes it would get really serious and you'd have people getting stabbed in the tops of their heads. And you'd have like backs getting broken around columns as people were getting strangled. I mean, there was some it would go from like really crazy nonsense to like some horrifyingly violent death scenes. And I was like, there's an odd balance here. And I was like, is that just 1922? Lack of censors and all that. They would just kind of throw it all in there. I don't know. So the tone was a little funky for me, but I still had fun with it. And I enjoyed the overall story, even if weirdly, I will say I enjoyed the story of Robin Hood and kind of seeing how it evolved, but I kind of didn't like Douglas Fairbanks that much. And I don't know if that's sacrilegious or not, but I feel like maybe it is a little bit.
No, I totally get you. I had trouble. If I had trouble connecting with anyone, it was with Robin Hood. I actually found that I liked him more as the Earl before he took on the mantle of Robin Hood than I did in the back half of the movie. I thought the whole story about how he is the hand of Richard and is he's this jousting champion. I mean, he's a nobleman and he goes off on the Crusades, which, the long arc of history does not remember kindly the Crusades. And it is treated here like like a noble journey for him. Dare I say a crusade. And that he comes back to take on that mantle, I think was it was a much more interesting transformation than I ever would have expected in a film like this. And then it kind of comes off the rails. We get a lot of the really fun 1920s like stunts. We get that wonderful, slide down the tapestry that he does, that two-story like that. That's just one of those magnificent little fun, bits of I think that might be one of the things you're calling silliness, but I loved. No, that's not the silliness for me. I'll get to the silliness. All right, but I never quite bought him as the Hood. Like he just always seemed like a guy in tights, and then they introduce about 1,000 other guys who look exactly like him in tights, and it really falls into chaos pretty quickly. Yeah.
No, the silliness for me is there are such antics between him and his men and I mean, even from the beginning, like some of just like the silly games that they're playing, like just the drinking games, and just the way that they're all acting with each other when they're all the merry men just kind of hanging out. And I get it. It's kind of guys hanging out and stuff. But then, and so some of that was silly, but then like there's the scene when they are all, so Robin Hood and his men are holding a place, and I can't remember which place it is. And they're peeking over the top of the gate, and they hear them saying, "Oh, go around to the side door." And they go, "Oh, let's go over to the side door." And so Robin Hood and his men go to the side door. And as the bad guys' men start coming through the side door, Robin Hood bops them each on the head. And his men toss him into the well. And it's a very shallow well because all their legs stick out. And they keep doing this. And eventually you have 50 pairs of legs sticking out of this well. And I was like, this is like Looney Tunes. I mean, it was so bananas silly. I was really surprised that that's where we kind of ended up going with some of these scenes. Like they took them to be just so silly and campy and kind of fun, which is fine. But then there's that scene where he jabs a dagger into the top of somebody's head. And then the way that he kills, was it the Sir Guy of Gisborne? Is that the one who he strangles and wraps around the big column and cracks his back?
Yeah, that was a tough one.
It's geesh.
Yeah. Yeah, I wanted to talk about that. The scope of violence in this movie, I did not expect this sort of simulated violence, and that strangling I thought was particularly in the context of this film gruesome, and it surprised me because of what I know of later Robin Hoods, that that sort of experience of Robin Hood seems so modern, for lack of a better word, right? I mean, I feel like we get much more of that in the later versions of Robin Hood, where we actually see some of the grittiness that we're going to be talking about moving forward, and much more of that sort of realistic violence. And to see it played out here in this character that otherwise is celebrated as a character, enjoying feats of daring do, seemed out of context for me.
That for me was the kind of the strangeness of the story, is it would go from kind of some really silly antics to some really kind of strong, violent moments. So, no censors obviously at the time. And so they were able to kind of do that without as much worry. But still, I don't know, it's a little strange for me. And I mean, it didn't kill the movie or anything for me, but it was just a note that I had that did pull me out. But yeah, going back to Douglas Fairbanks, I will say the thing that I do like about him is that he works really well in these epics. He feels like a swashbuckler, like the way that he moves, the way that he, dances so lightly across the top edge of the wall before jumping onto that big, the tapestry and sliding down, as you said, or scrambling up the chain in the gate so that he can get up inside. He does that so well, and he just looks so natural with it. So I do like those elements of Douglas Fairbanks, but I do think that, just as kind of that Robin Hood, I just felt like there were elements of him that were just, I don't know, it kind of became a little stale after a point, Question outside the movie. What version did you watch? I watched the version that is on Amazon, and it is 2 hours, straight up 2 hours.
Okay. That's the frame stretched version, right? That's been normalized across the thing, so it's not super fast in most places.
Yeah, it all looked relatively normal speed, correct.
So as it was released, my understanding is that the finished time was 10 minutes shorter than that. So when they normalized the speed, it ended up being 10 minutes longer.
I found varying times. I found 127 minutes. I also found 143 minutes.
Interesting. Well, the version I think on iTunes was 212, and that's what is that? 132 minutes.
Yeah.
And so I was frustrated by that, and thank God for public domain. I went onto YouTube and I watched it I watched the first half hour of it, and then I went to YouTube and I watched it at 125%, right? With ramped up. And that took it down to 105. So even a little bit faster than originally released, but it felt much more like the tone, like the speed of movement fit the tone of what was originally released. And so I say all that because I get the feeling that the way I watched the movie fit much more of the swashbuckling Douglas Fairbanks than even reality would have done it. Like, he felt like this fairy tale character that Robin Hood, the fairy tale character that and so there was a part of that that I think helped me be even more of an apologist for some of the silliness, because it was all moving like an old movie, like a silent film, like it was being hand cranked.
Well, and it's funny because when you're looking at silent films, I think a lot of the times it really does boil down to presentation and how you are looking at the film. Yeah. I was watching like I said, the version on Amazon, and it has a bunch of public domain music as the background, and it worked for a little while. And then all of a sudden it's like, I realize I'm listening to like the Maple Leaf Rag while I'm watching Robin Hood. And I'm like, what? This is like bananas music to be playing with this. And I didn't want to listen to it silent. I had a film teacher in college who refused to play any silent film with sound because he said, unless it was music that they were playing at the time, then we're not playing it. And so we watched all of the silent films in my film history class silently. And I swear it put me to sleep every time. It was so like, you're just staring at this in dead silence. It was awful.
That's horrific. I usually will default to just putting on The Wall.
Well, what I did, and actually what I found, it actually worked really well, is I put on other Robin Hood soundtracks. I didn't want to put on the Kevin Costner one, but I did put on the Ridley Scott version that Mark Streitenfeld did.
Yeah.
And the score, it gave nice mood music. It doesn't have like strong themes or anything. It was just nice mood music that actually worked really nicely for me. So that's how I ended up watching it. But it is funny, silent films, there is a context, the frame rates kind of there was this variance in them, and then the music, and so all of these different things. And so it does affect how you receive a film. Yeah, I will definitely agree to that.
Let's talk a little bit more about Robin Hood. What is your memory of Robin Hood, and how well does this movie fit into that?
My Robin Hood experiences as a kid, I think a lot of them, and I think a lot of people our age are probably going to say this, stem from the 1973 Disney animated version. Mm-hmm. I think so many versions of Robin Hood, I think it pulled from a lot of them. And so it had a lot of those. And so as I go back and watch these other ones, I see, okay, well, they're all kind of in there. And I'm sure I had other like Robin Hood books and stuff when I was a kid. I'm sure it's just one of those characters that you know of. He steals from the rich and gives to the poor. Eventually, I also watched Time Bandits, and John Cleese's Robin Hood became possibly my favorite Robin Hood. It's just jolly good. And so I don't know. I think Robin Hood's a really interesting character, and I enjoy these types of characters that are kind of in this space of public domain where people can kind of play with them and play with their interpretations. I think it's great. There were elements here that I think they hit pretty well. I liked the way that he saw the injustices, and I liked his. I will say that one of my biggest struggles was his connection to Maid Marian, or Lady Marian, as she is in this film. The whole, when he's not connected to any woman before they all go off to the Crusades, King Richard is trying to get him to hook up with a woman, and he's just like, I'm afeard of women. I was like,
give me a break.
Wow. Yeah. That was a little bit of a jump back to 1922, hearing that.
Yes.
And so, the courtship with Lady Marian was a little awkward. I ended up liking their relationship, but I found it to be a rough start for me.
And a long start. That whole sequence of the early, royal dating games was significant part of the first hour of the film. And I just have to talk through one or two of these. So this is after the joust, and they're all sitting down and they're playing their little drinking games. Had you ever seen the booze tug of war portrayed on film?
I've never seen it on film, but we do that all the time. at our house. I don't know. I don't know how you haven't heard of it before.
More telling than I would have expected. No, the whole idea here is that each of the participants is holding on to the stem of a giant goblet that is full of the booze, and I wasn't clear. There's somebody behind each one of the participants with a stick hovering over their forehead, and you're playing tug-of-war with your arms, and I guess you lose, like you're trying to get the goblet to your mouth, and you lose drink, if you lean forward, and if your head touches the stick.
Right, yeah, right. I was under the impression that it was a knife, not a stick, and that you would slice your forehead if you got pulled forward.
So they take it very seriously.
Yeah,
boozy tug of war. That was something I never. I mean, this ain't no beer pong, people.
It's early arm wrestling or something. I don't know.
And they're very physical with one another. Did you notice this? People are restraining other people all the time, left and right. They seem to be having a good time, and suddenly there's a gang of people restraining another person for reasons I could not tell.
It was, I mean, a lot of those elements do feel very silent film. Like it feels like big acting, very theatrical, just the way that they were bringing those things in. Just it felt like they were still having fun with the new format, but it still felt more theatrical than cinematic.
So this first 40 minutes, I think, by my gauge, is the building up to the leaving on the Crusades, and then we get this experience of John, the regent now, who has taken over for Richard the Lionhearted while he's off on his crusades, and things fall apart under John. And so what I was saying earlier about how my experience with Robin Hood usually picks up right about then, right when Robin Hood comes back from the Crusades, as those of us of a certain age, our central sort of experience of a modern Robin Hood is Costner's, and they're coming back from the Crusades, and then they experience what it's like to return. We get so much of the story before that in this movie, and I wonder your opinion on how well that was needed.
Yeah, it is a lot of backstory kind of building up to a point where we actually get Robin Hood, because you're right. I mean, 40 minutes of the backstory leading up to them leaving for the Crusades. Then we have probably 20 minutes of Crusades, and then, John ruining England and them sending a message to Robin, or not. What was his name? Is not secret name. Robert of I'm blanking on it now. The Earl of Huntingdon.
Earl of Huntingdon, yeah. Huntingdon.
Huntingdon.
Yeah.
Right. So he gets the message, and then it's this thing about flying a dove back with his message and all that sort of stuff, and then getting taken prisoner. I mean, that went on for another probably, 25 minutes or so before he actually escapes and makes it back to England, where he can become Robin Hood. I mean, it's a hefty chunk of time. We're well over the hour mark before he's Robin Hood and starts helping people. So does that work for you? I mean, is that a thing, or did you find yourself just getting antsy and ready to get to Robin Hood? Was the origin story part of value? It was, because I think your point is actually a valid one, because I don't feel like I have often seen so much of his backstory. I think most people, they start when he either comes back to England, and we're just starting with him arriving and just seeing kind of the devastation, or he's already there. Oh, and this is just a side note. Another Robin Hood version that I grew up on is the Daffy Duck version.
Okay.
Which I love. But yeah, he's there already, and he's just kind of already this myth out in the woods who's robbing from the rich and stealing from the poor. Or like the Kevin Costner one, where it starts and he's already on the Crusades and he's coming back.
Yes.
I feel like this is probably the first time I've seen this much backstory in the Robin Hood story. And so to that end, I did find it actually to be interesting, and I liked the setup, and I liked the way that they gave it to us. it's slow, and that's, I think, the downside. But and it's weird because it's the downside that it's slow, but it's also the fact that it's a silent film becomes an upside in that case, because I end up just kind of taking all of that for what it is and saying, well, this is a film from 1922. This is how they told these stories. If they told this story today this way, I think it would be, they'd really have to find a way to amp it up a little bit, because it really kind of lingers a little too long on the departure.
That's why you put Taron Egerton in it.
Right. I think my understanding is the Russell Crowe version, we're going to have more of this backstory.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So we come back, and this is after that big transition, and I have to say, they got the message with the birds, and we get some hot bird on bird attack action in the aerial battle.
That was nuts.
Which reminded me a little bit of our journey to the volcano in
Stromboli.
The journey to the volcano in Stromboli with the rabbit and the ferret. That was
holy cow.
This animal thing. Mm-hmm. You start to see why they maybe put some regulation around that.
Right.
Anyhow, so now we meet Robin Hood. And we've already mentioned this is kind of where things fall apart. And yet this is also central to our, as we alluded to earlier, central to our human enjoyment of what Robin Hood represents, which is the idea of getting back at those who have wronged us and doing so in a way that sort of publicly embarrasses them. What do you think of that, the sort of gestalt of vengeance around Robin Hood here?
Well, it's funny because I never thought so much that Robin Hood was all about vengeance so much as doing what's right. And I think there's a fine line in that interpretation, because stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, he's obviously he's stealing from people, but he's doing it to help other people. But I don't know, in my mind, it never was quite so violent. But I guess in context, obviously there ends up being violence when you take it out of, foxes and other animals in the Disney cartoon version. And
I see our central problem here.
Right, exactly. So, it ends up, so I think the violence, the nature of the character, I think is an interesting one. And I think that's something I really like exploring about Robin Hood, is the fact that he's basically decides, the only way I can help society and help England is by turning my back on what the king says is the way it is, and turning into a criminal. I mean, it's like the first superhero, right? I mean, he's basically Batman. He's going to stop a corrupt society and do what he can to help those who need it. It's actually a really interesting kind of angle to kind of take and look at what this guy is. And I think if you look at it that way, and you look at these bards and people who were writing these songs and stories about Robin Hood back in the 13 and 1400s, very much so. I think it was something for people to latch onto like a superhero.
Well, this is the class, right? This is the battle of the classes here of hundreds of years of British history, right? Centrally sort of experiencing British history here through Robin Hood, a centrally British character, and the idea that we have royalty and these vested landowners who have wronged the people. Robin Hood becomes a vessel for the people who have been wronged. And that's really important. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be, and as we've seen so many times, it doesn't have to be a particularly violent story to be a story of vengeance, right? Of just getting back at those who have wronged us, and how good that feels to have that experience publicized in some way. And I think that's one of the reasons that giving back to the poor, it's not just about doing right. It's about giving resources of those we don't like and don't trust to ourselves, right? To the people by way of this voice of Robin Hood. And that is its own publicity, right? Did you hear the story of maybe he'll come to our village, maybe he'll come to our farm, maybe we'll end up seeing some of these riches that have been taken by way of taxation illegally. And that's to me, that's the story of Robin Hood. And that's what makes, Robin Hood such a fantastic story today, because it's still happening today. And that's the kind of story we love to read.
Well, and especially one where they create such indelible characters like Robin Hood, like, King John, King Richard, both of them.
Well, the sheriff.
Made the Sheriff of Nottingham, absolutely. The Merry Men, Maid Marian, Little John, and Friar Tuck. Like, all of these characters are such like indelible elements of the story that kind of almost become archetypes within the story that give reason for it to continue being told, because they each have their part and they each help this story kind of blossom in lots of interesting ways. So I think it's just a really interesting story that, obviously it's one that has been evolving for hundreds of years. So let it continue evolving and let filmmakers kind of continue to explore with it.
You want to talk a little bit about getting it made?
This is a film that Douglas Fairbanks was trying to figure out what he wanted to do in his career. And, it was, I don't know how early this was in his career. He'd been acting for quite a while already through the teens of silent cinema. And but still had some big films to come after this, like The Thief of Baghdad. And I think after a few years after this, I think he would do The Iron Mask again with Allan Dwan at the helm. And but he was trying to decide what he wanted to do, and he was either going to do The Virginian, an adaptation of the book of that story by Owen Wister, or he was going to do Monsieur, and I don't know if I'm going to say this right, Beaucaire. Is that how you say it? Monsieur Beaucaire by Booth Tarkington. And
I'll go with that.
Yeah, he had optioned the film rights to both of those. And he also had done The Mark of Zorro a few years earlier, 1920. And he thought that maybe he would do a sequel to that. But I'm not exactly sure how this story fell into his lap. But I don't know. I just think that it was part of his own production company, Douglas Fairbanks Pictures Corporation, and part of United Artists distributed. And of course, he was one of the founding members of United Artists. Him, Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, and D.W. Griffith. And I think it was just one of those things where he just kind of latched onto this instead of those other projects and took off with it. And I mean, he does work in context of the role because of that swashbuckling nature that he has. So I think to that end, I think he put together a good team here. Allan Dwan as the director, who, I mean, he is a guy who ended up directing like 500 plus movies, something like that. Just crazy how many films he directed, and starting in the like early teens. And I mean, he kind of was a B director, and directed tons of stuff, but this was one of his biggest. And I think it's just because of the story. It just turned into something that all of the pieces fell into place. He was the right director. Douglas Fairbanks was the right actor. They had the right script. And there it is.
This Douglas Fairbanks, I'm enamored by him now more than ever, not just because of this movie, but because, Andy, he's a Colorado dude.
We like those. That's right.
He was born in Ullman, Colorado, small town. He was in summer stock at Elitch's, Andy. Elitch's, the Elitch Gardens.
Amusement park, yeah.
We were there, man.
I know. They were celebrating their 100th anniversary when we were in college. Do you remember?
I'm not sure it's still there anymore. Is it gone?
They moved Elitch's to downtown Denver from its original location. I don't think any of the old Elitch's exists in its place anymore. Although I know they ported over some of the rides. Well,
that is crushing because I have such fond memories of Elitch's, but now I have fond memories of me and you and Douglas Fairbanks hanging out at Elitch's in summer stock 100 years ago.
That is cool. That's a really fun find.
Very, very cool. You mentioned the archetypes of these characters, and I think there are some in here that are particularly strong. I wasn't as crazy about Marion, but I have to call out Little John, the Squire. Little John, played by Alan Hale. I thought he was terrific.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He was great. So much so that he was asked to reprise his role in the 1938 The Adventures of Robin Hood, when Errol Flynn took on the mantle of Robin Hood. And then in Rogues of Sherwood Forest, 1950, he was asked again to play the character because people loved him as Little John so much. And I don't know if this is still true, but at the time the notes were written, it was the longest period for any actor to appear in the same role in film history.
Well, it's amazing, and I think actually serves the character of Little John, right? I mean, you sort of need a more mature, sort of older guy in that role. I think it actually works to watch him age with the character over the course of these decades. Be curious to see the interpretations of these characters in some of the other films coming up.
Yeah, and I am a little bummed now that Rogues of Sherwood Forest did not end up making the cut of the films that we're going to be talking about. But we will at least get to look at him again in The Adventures of Robin Hood, 1938.
Who else stood out for you in the, we'll call them the archetypes?
Well, I have to call this out about Maid Marian or Lady Marian. Enid Bennett played her, but her name is Lady Marian Fitzwalter.
I know. Where does that come from?
No offense to any Fitzwalters out there, but I just did not expect that as her last name when they called it out. Marian Fitzwalter. What?
Do you get the feeling maybe that they struggled to get it written and maybe had some sort of a contest? Maybe it was the early patrons who said, hey, I'll donate some money if you'll
put this
put my kid's name in the film. Yeah, I thought that took me out of the movie more than any of the other silliness.
It was just such a strange name to bring in there.
We're laughing about it, and that's not just to hear ourselves laugh. It just sounds very strange, and I'm sure someone's going to write us and tell us, well, Fitzwalter is one of the oldest names in Britain.
Right.
And that's fine too. It still doesn't sound right. So
well, and it's funny because I read through the Wikipedia breakdown of Robin Hood and all the myths of Robin Hood and just kind of all the different various stories, and it was pretty interesting to kind of get a sense of him and the characters and everything. And Marian is always identified simply as Maid Marian.
Yes,
there's no reference ever to Marian Fitzwalter. So I can't believe that that's actually something that is canon. I feel like somebody threw that in as a joke.
In our defense, a little live research. The surname of Fitzwalter was a baptismal name, son of Walter. The Norman French word Fitz signifies son and was derived from the Latin filius. The old spelling is usually Fizz, and the application of it has been to denote the many natural sons of royalty. The personal name was introduced into England in the reign of the Confessor. It is listed as a tenant in the Domesday Book of 1086. Edmund Filius Walter of the country of Cambridgeshire in 1273. This name goes back. So let's just say there may have been somebody reading the Doomsday Book of 1086 and found a Fitzwalter and thought Marian would be great with it. But it still sounds weird. I stand by it sounding weird.
Yeah.
With all due respect to the Fitzwalters of modern podcast audiences.
I have to call out to Wallace Beery, who plays King Richard the Lionhearted in this version. Wallace Beery is one of those actors who's just got a great face. I actually think that he works really well as King Richard the Lionhearted. And actually, obviously, the people around him did as well, because he ended up coming back a few years later to play the same character in the film Richard the Lionhearted. So obviously he worked well for the role. But Wallace Beery, he's one of those actors that you see in, he's just been in lots of different films. And I'm trying to remember the one that stands out to me. He was in Buster Keaton's The Three Ages, which was kind of the Buster Keaton's spoof version of D.W. Griffith's Intolerance. And then he was in The Champ with Jackie Cooper, which is, I think, maybe one of the more famous roles of his. And he was in Dinner at 8. And there's another one that is a very familiar one that stood out to me as I was looking at Grand Hotel. He was in that one. And he's a face that I think works really well in context of these old films. So he was the other one that I wanted to call out.
Well, I'm glad you called him out. But I think in this film, when I think about Wallace Beery, all I can think about is that jester that's always with him. And did he end up doing anything special with his career? Because if not, that is a sore misuse of resources.
I'm glad you brought the jester up. So this is something that I thought was actually pretty interesting. We have a moment in this film where Sir Guy of Gisborne goes to assassinate King Richard. And this is when they're out on the Crusades, and he sneaks into his tent and he stabs him to death. And then he rides back to England to tell Prince John that he had killed him. As it turns out, it was the jester who was sleeping in King Richard's bed. And King Richard came into his room shortly afterward and pulled back the covers and saw that the jester was there. And was just like, you played the king once too many, my dear friend, or whatever. And so we talked about King Richard very briefly when we were looking at The Lion in Winter. That was the character that is gay. He was in a homosexual relationship with Tim. Whose character was that? Timothy Dalton's character was the one.
French.
The French prince.
Yeah,
right.
Prince.
And Anthony Hopkins was King or Prince Richard at the time, and it was so that was an interesting theory that people have had about Richard, is that he had homosexual tendencies. And it's not something that I really ever thought about before. But then the fact that they had the jester in his bed, and I was like, oh, that was really interesting. I wonder if the filmmakers and the storytellers here were throwing that in as just kind of a hint as to this idea that King Richard the Lionhearted might have been gay or kind of closeted. It was an interesting thing. I mean, I'm not sure, but there weren't censors at the time, so it's possible.
Well, you have to ask, what was he doing in bed, in the king's bed? Right. You don't throw that in accidentally.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing to kind of throw in. And for me, in a 1922 film, an interesting thing to be put forth as something to think about. A few other notes, Pete, about the cast before we move forward. Just a couple notes regarding the background players. This was a very expensive film. And, in the silent days, they couldn't just generate characters with CG or use cardboard cutouts. They could use cardboard cutouts, but I don't think they were. They were just hiring people. They had, at several points throughout the film, as many as 1,200 extras on set to fill these scenes. And which is
1,100 of them were dressed as Robin Hood at one point.
Right. It's like the Three Amigos.
Right.
Amigos.
Amigos. Well, it is interesting to note just how strong everybody was in the movie. This was a movie that really celebrates virility and masculinity. They threw each other a lot to the point where obviously they weren't. There was one point where Robin Hood picks the guy up over his head and throws him off a balcony.
Yeah.
And that seemed potentially out of physical character. I don't know how strong a man Douglas Fairbanks actually was, but that felt like it was out of character.
Well, there were a number of moments throughout the film that I was like, they were doing things that seemed completely just illogical as far as physics were concerned. Like Little John, he picks up a guy when they're out in the forest, and he throws him
into a tree,
the guy, all the way up into not just into a tree next to him, but up high in a tree.
Yes, literally up into a tree. Yeah,
right.
It's brilliant.
What is going on here? No law of physics with this film.
We've talked about Arthur Edison before, central figure in the early days of formalizing cinematography as a profession. And, the camera work, I think, is able camera work for a 1922 film. And, insofar as they stick it up on sticks and run the camera, it felt very, it felt about as proscenium as the setting was.
Yeah, I think that's my sense of the silent film sets is that, there wasn't anything that stood out as fun play. I mean, that was one thing with silent film is you were allowed to move your camera and put them in different places and do things that were a little more experimental. And I didn't feel like there was a lot of that here. It felt pretty straightforward.
I will say that the structure that they built, the castle and the nearly full-size village of Nottingham was extensive.
Yeah, that's something that, and these sets were so big at the time, what they would do is they would build these sets outdoors. I mean, they are interior scenes, like the inside of the castle, but it's so big, this banquet hall, that it's basically an open air set because there wasn't a space where they could do that. And so they would do this just out in open space. And they made this huge set, which at the time was one of the largest sets built for silent films. And I think that that's just something that they would do to kind of create these worlds. And, I respect that. I mean, obviously it costs a lot of money and they put a lot of time and energy into it. But I think that in the case of creating the world, they did some great world building with that.
Well, and the investment by Fairbanks and Pickford, they bought this ranch, as I understand it, to make that work. It was essentially their own studio, right? I mean, did you read that?
I didn't, but I do know that, it was his production company that was behind this, so I'd be surprised at all that that's exactly how they did it.
Substantial.
I just want to go, before we push on, I do want to jump back to music again real quick. So what I found as I was reading about this, I found that it was actually pretty interesting that, a couple things. So Sid Grauman, who had the theaters out in L.A., he had just built his Egyptian theater, and he actually he thought of this idea of having this big gala premiere. And this movie apparently was the first one to have a big gala premiere. Sid Grauman kind of put this whole thing together. And what's interesting is that Victor Schertzinger was hired to write the music for this film by Fairbanks and wrote an actual original score for the film, which unfortunately, like I said, I was listening to ragtime and just stuff that didn't fit at all. I would love to hear what the score sounded like, but it's not, it didn't play on what I was watching. So I'd love to actually hear what it sounded like. What I did find interesting, which I think is probably a first, Sid Grauman actually wrote a song with Victor Schertzinger called Just an Old Love Song that tied into the music, and they used it to promote the picture. And again, I couldn't find that song either, but how interesting is that like the theater owner collaborated with the composer to put together music that they would use to help market the movie.
It's fantastic. I love it.
Yeah. I'd love to see people doing that these days.
Yeah. Harkins, AMC. I'm sure they would love to, the CEOs would love to get in there and start tinkering. Finally,
I can get back to my lyricist career I've always been wanting to do.
I just have always wanted to push more buttons. What you're listening to is a sponsored message. This will be removed from the show for subscribers in Patreon. That's right. Patrons hear no ads. That's just one perk of supporting The Next Reel at thenextreel.com/Patreon. Wait, you want more? How about early access to the show before the rest of the world? How about an online community dedicated to talking movies with channels just for members? Or how about this? You can sleep soundly knowing that you've pledged to support the podcasting careers of a team of dedicated movie lovers eager to grow the show, this community, and to build more resources for learning about great movies. Support the show at thenextreel.com/Patreon. How to do it award season, Andy?
This was a period of time where there just weren't that many awards yet. There was still this There were no Academy Awards. It was, a new medium. And so just people hadn't kind of adapted, like, let's give awards to these crazy movies. It wasn't something that was happening much. However, it did win one award, the Photoplay Awards. Douglas Fairbanks got the Medal of Honor. I think that's fantastic that's what they give out.
That's so funny. It's like, did that come up right after Best Diorama Award? It's a moving box.
Right. Yeah, it's so funny that that's what they gave out. But that's the only award that this film is listed for having received.
And too bad, but we should say Douglas Fairbanks was a principal founder of the Motion Picture Association. So maybe he ended up doing it so he could give himself an award later.
Right.
How to do at the box office? Do we have any numbers?
The records are a bit hazy as to the final budget for Allan Dwan's take on Robin Hood. According to some sources, the budget was about $930,000. Others say it was the highest budgeted film at the time, about $1.5 million. According to Jeffrey Vance, who's the author of the biography Douglas Fairbanks, he apparently found definitive figures that do show the final film cost for production $930,042.78. It is very specific. So
it's got to be right.
I don't disbelieve him, but I don't want to disbelieve that it was the highest budgeted film at the time. Knowing, as we've discussed so many times, knowing the studios spend money on prints and advertising, I'm going to take Vance's number as the production budget, as he said, and the remaining approximately $570,000 as prints and advertising costs, giving us that total of about $1.5 million, which is about $22.8 million in today's dollars. Still pretty cheap for a big action-adventure sort of film. The movie was released October 18th, 1922, and it was received well. In fact, many today see this as Dwan's masterpiece, even though, as I mentioned earlier, he directed over 500 films all the way up into the 60s. And many say that this film is the film, as we've been discussing, that sets the mark for subsequent Robin Hood films. The movie's gross is a bit squiffy as well, but from what I could tell, it made about $5.5 million at the box office, which is about $83 million in today's dollars. All told, that gives the film an adjusted profit per finished minute of $420,000.
I just learned a new word, Andy. Do you know what it is?
Squiffy.
That's the one. I am really impressed. I had to look that right up.
Isn't it a great word?
You know what isn't squiffy is probably $100 of that production cost went to the tapestry ball. You know how they did that? We didn't even say.
How?
They put a 2-story playground slide underneath the tapestry. So he let go, sliding on top of the tapestry, but under him, hidden under the tapestry, was a slide. Fancy that, right? $100.
I feel like you'd still get rug burn.
Yeah, no, he doesn't. Nobody comes out looking good after a fall like that. Well, this was a really fun way to open this series, Andy. I actually liked it, and I don't know. I don't know that we're too far off. I think you accused me of liking the movie more than you did, and so I'm very curious how it's going to stand up in our rankings.
Yeah, I am too. This will be an interesting one to see because it's a film that I enjoyed. It's not something that I would return to often. You know, I found some interesting elements to it, but at the same time, I'm like, yeah, okay, I've seen it. I can check that off the list and not have to come back to it.
I say we dig in and rank it.
Let's do it.
Head over to flickchart.com/thenextreel, and you'll see all the movies that we've talked about on this very show. If you swipe over in your show notes and you click on or tap on or, indicate your preference to go to this location on the internet, the word Flickchart.
Wow.
I'm very thorough tonight. You'll be taken straight to this movie, and you can add it to your list and see how it stands up to ours.
All right, first up, we have Robin Hood. Or did you know, Pete, this is just a random aside, that there is debate if this film is called Robin Hood or if it is called Douglas Fairbanks in Robin Hood?
Who's debating it, Andy?
Wikipedia listed as Douglas Fairbanks in Robin Hood. The author that I mentioned who wrote the biography on Douglas Fairbanks, he calls it Douglas Fairbanks in Robin Hood.
Well,
It's bananas.
I think
to me.
I'll bet Douglas Fairbanks also calls it Douglas Fairbanks in Robin Hood.
I bet Douglas Fairbanks does. Anyway, first up, we have Robin Hood or Murder on the Orient Express, 1974.
Oh, I'm going to go with Murder.
Me too. Robin Hood or For Whom the Bell Tolls.
I think probably For Whom the Bell Tolls.
It's kind of hitting the point where I'm like, I'd rather watch Robin Hood.
Yeah. I don't know. It's a line for me too.
All right. So are we going to rock, paper, scissors this one?
God, if I cared. Okay.
I just like, I think about For Whom the Bell Tolls and I'm like, I don't know. It grows lesser and lesser in my mind over time.
Okay. That's fair. You know what? I'm going to give it to you. I'm not even going to fight it.
All right. That's because I sold it so well.
You did.
Robin Hood or Russian Dolls?
Russian Dolls.
Our favorite end to it wasn't the second film of I'll take Russian Dolls. Robin Hood or The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest?
Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest.
Yeah, same for me. Robin Hood or Red Belt?
Red Belt.
I'll give you Red Belt. Robin Hood. Look at this awful, awful picture of Douglas Fairbanks. It's like he's a red devil. What the hell?
You know, he looks like Mel Brooks, a young Mel Brooks.
I don't know. Looks something. I don't know. Something's going on. Robin Hood or The Sandlot?
Sandlot.
Totally The Sandlot.
Yeah, no question.
Robin Hood or The Adventures of Baron Munchausen?
Go with Munchausen, please.
Going with Munchausen. Robin Hood or Christmas in July?
I liked Christmas in July. That was sweet. I'd rather watch that.
All right. Me too. Robin Hood or La Femme Nikita?
Very much Nikita.
Yes, very much Nikita. Well, that lands Robin Hood or Douglas Fairbanks in Robin Hood in spot 308 on our chart. 308 out of 410, which is about a 25%.
Well, that's not very good. And we didn't have to fight over it very much. So I think we actually probably agree on this movie. I'm not sure how I feel about that. How'd it do on your own chart?
A little worse, actually. And I think it's it ends up falling to the rewatchability factor. You know, so many times I'm like, well, it's probably a better movie, but I'm not going to put it on before that other movie. It landed at 34.57 out of 41.68, which is about a 17% on my chart.
Well, this landed at 868 out of 1,095 on my chart, which is 21%. So yeah, we're right in the ballpark. But what does that mean for letterboxd.com/thenextreel? If we go by the algorithm, that should be 1 star.
I'm not giving it that.
What are you giving it?
I'm giving it 2.5 stars, no like.
Ugh, that feels better to me. I was nervous there that we had to go by the 1 star. It says 1 star. We go by the robots, but because when I finished this thing, that's where my enthusiasm comes from. I finished this movie. I was like, well, that was a jolly good time. And even though I wasn't crazy about, Fairbanks' portrayal of Robin Hood, I do really like Robin Hood and I like what it stands for. And I like the fun plays we get to have in the class discussion. And so I was going to land right at a 3 star and be okay with that. And then we had this discussion and then the 1 star and I just didn't know what to do. I panicked. So I am going to go 3 stars. To like or not to like, though? I think I like it.
That is the question.
I'm going to like it. Okay. 3 stars and a like, Andy.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's okay. It's okay that you have a 3 stars and a like, and it's low on your flick chart, because that's just the nature of things,
yes.
right?
It
is life in the big city.
Crying. What does that mean for us now? Where do we go from here? Our next stop in the Robin Hood train. We
are going to jump to 1938 and look at possibly one of the most iconic, if not the most popular versions of Robin Hood. It is Errol Flynn's version from 1938, The Adventures of Robin Hood.
That's the one right there, right?
It is one that people often talk about as being Robin Hood. And I think a lot of it is just the swashbuckling nature of it. I think it's the Technicolor. A lot of those things, I think, work in context of selling the story of Robin Hood.
Well, I'm excited about it. That is next in our series. Don't forget, if you haven't had a chance to check out the Marvel Movie Minute, we just wrapped last month, season 1 of the Marvel Movie Minute with 2009's Iron Man. It was great fun, all 126 minutes of it. And we're gearing up for a 2020 release of The Hulk. So this is a great time. Take a few months while we're not doing a new Marvel Movie Minute as we round out the end of the year to go back and listen to Iron Man. You should give it a shot. It's fantastic.
A lot of fun talking about that movie. And in context of Spider-Man Far From Home, it's even more relevant to go back and listen to it.
And how, when the movie ends,
our conversation begins.
Amazon giveth, Andy.
As Amazon always doeth.
Yeah, they sometimes do, and I think they may have come through. We'll see.
Yeah.
Where'd you land?
I went low. I went down to a 1 star.
Oh, dark days in the Amazon, the bowels, the depths of the Amazon.
Indeed. 1 star by NN, who says, depends what you're interested in. I was just curious and clicked on this film. I didn't watch it through, but it's a very old film that is what it says. Silent. Made without any voice recordings. Good to watch if you're looking into the historical aspects of movies, but was a bit boring for me.
A bit boring. Well, maybe Lucy can help with her guidance in this 2-star review. Great video, horrid music. She's a fan of yours, Andy.
Yes.
This video was of very good quality. And Douglas Fairbanks is always incredible. The story is so different than most modern versions of Robin Hood, it was very interesting to follow. However, a happy honky-tonk piano played the same tunes throughout the entire movie. When the mood should have been somber or tense or melancholy, the happy honky-tonk piano would not shut up. It really ruined the experience. It was that happy honky-tonk piano, Andy.
It was. That's what it was, Pete. If only I could have put it into such words as she.
I hope old Errol Flynn includes a happy honky-tonk piano somewhere in his rendition of Robin Hood. I know Kevin Costner did.
We're going to have to really listen for that. We'll do happy honky-tonk piano call-outs.
We're going to need the happy honky-tonk piano Robin Hood review. Thanks, Amazon. It's hard to believe we have been having in-depth weekly conversations about movies since 2011.
Oh, you're telling me. Producing this show week after week is so much fun, but it does require a ton of work behind the scenes. If you'd like to help support our efforts, one easy way is by using our Originals page when shopping for books and movies that we've covered.
Your purchases made through our links give us a small commission at no extra cost to you and allow us to keep having these great discussions.
We are highlighting adaptations from Season 9 over at our Originals page, thenextreel.com/originals. That's the site where listeners can purchase the source material for all of our adapted film discussions.
We had a big Robin Hood series this season, looking at 9 different versions on screen. Many were likely adapted from Howard Pyle's The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood, including Douglas Fairbanks in Robin Hood, The Adventures of Robin Hood, Disney's Robin Hood Prince of Thieves, and the 1991 Robin Hood, and Ridley Scott's Robin Hood.
Robin and Marian was specifically based on the ballad The Jest of Robin Hood.
And we really don't have too much to say about Robin and the Seven Hoods.
We talked Dead Ringers for our David Cronenberg series adapted from Barry Wood and Jack Geislin's novel Twins.
Have you checked out that show?
You know, I haven't, but I've heard great things.
2 comedies from our Steve Martin series were adaptations, Pennies from Heaven from the BBC series, and The Lonely Guy from the book by Bruce J. Friedman.
The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas was part of our Colin Higgins series, adapted from the Broadway musical.
Spike Lee brought us Black Klansman from Ron Stallworth's memoir.
And we looked at a trio of John le Carré adaptations, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, The Little Drummer Girl, and Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy.
Plus, all 3 movies in our Agnieszka Holland series were based on books, Europa, In Darkness, and Spore.
La Cage aux Folles and its remake The Birdcage both came from Jean Poiret's original play.
We also talked about Arsenic and Old Lace and Charade in our Cary Grant series.
All of these were based on other material, and it is all available on our originals page, thenextreel.com/originals. Every book purchased supports the podcast.
Get the full list of adaptations we've covered and start your next read today at thenextreel.com/originals.